from Kansas. You'll see behind me Olathe, Kansas. So I appreciate the chance to join and to talk about my favorite of SBA's socioeconomic programs, if I could choose a favorite, and that is the HUBZone program. I think it's a wonderful program, not only for businesses, but for communities. But unfortunately, this program, as we'll discuss a little bit today, has been underutilized, which is an irony in itself. And so hopefully today, understanding a little bit more about the HUBZone program. If you're a participant in the HUBZone program already, hopefully this is a refresher for some of those items and some clarification for you. Or if you're thinking about becoming a HUBZone participant, hopefully this presentation helps raise some light to those requirements. Now, I'm excited to join because it means that you all have connected with Yasmin and her team at the Maryland PTAC. And let me say that I work with a lot of small business government contractors, and usually my first piece of advice, no matter where they are in the contracting arena, whether they're new or experienced, is to connect with their PTAC. Well, I guess I should say now Apex Accelerator, because of the wonderful services that are provided. So I certainly encourage you, if you have not yet sat down with your Apex counselor, certainly encourage you to do so because of the value that they bring. And so with that, let's go ahead and kind of break into today's discussion. I am Matthew Schoonover. The point of this slide is not to show you my face, but to tell you that I am the managing member of Schoonover and Moriarty. We are a law firm that works with government contractors all across the country, primarily small businesses. And as part of our practice, we counsel clients on a lot of the regulatory issues that they face, including complying with SBA's socioeconomic program regulations. With that in mind, I encourage you to please not take today's presentation to be legal advice. A lot of these issues that we'll discuss are kind of nuanced, and their application to your particular situation may be nuanced as well. So please don't take today's presentation to be legal advice. If you have specific questions, again, sit down with your Apex counselor, reach out to a qualified government contracts attorney, me or somebody else, because these issues can be fairly complex. I also wanted to give a plug for our blog here at the firm, govconbrief.com. On GovConBrief, we write about a lot of these federal contracting topics as they relate to small business federal contractors. And, you know, yesterday, for example, I just posted on GovConBrief about the ostensible subcontractor affiliation rule and how for prime sub teams, it's certainly something that they need to be aware of when developing their teaming agreements and proposals and subcontracts, all of that. So we encourage you to check out GovConBrief and subscribe to it. We'd like for it to be a resource for small businesses. And as the name of the blog implies, we try to keep our posts pretty brief and to the point. So check out GovConBrief if you haven't yet had a chance to do so. As I can get my slide thing to work here. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about the HUBZone program, the historically underutilized business zone program, and it's kind of a complex program. And so we're going to break it down by first discussing, you know, what is a HUBZone? How do you know if you know your employees live in or your principal office is located in a HUBZone, for example? Then once we understand what a HUBZone is, or have a better idea of what a HUBZone is, we'll talk about the actual eligibility requirements that come to being a HUBZone company. And those again, can be fairly complex requirements. And then finally, we'll talk about how you can leverage that HUBZone status to help your business, why being a HUBZone may be beneficial to your small business. So let's break into it. And as I mentioned, you know, a HUBZone, hub is short for historically underutilized business zone. And so when we talk about what a HUBZone is, in general, think about areas that have seen some type of economic I don't want to use the word depression because an economist would tell me that that's a loaded term, but some sort of economic disadvantage in the entire community. These can come about in a lot of different ways. Perhaps the most common or the most significant of these ways is for qualified census tracts to be designated by the Department of Housing and Urban Development to be a historically underutilized business zone by reference of looking at the percentage of individuals or households in that tract with income that fall below a certain threshold, or a poverty rate for the tract that rises above a certain threshold. And so we see that entire census tracts may be designated as hub zones depending on the economics in that actual tract. There are also qualified non-metropolitan counties, some rural areas, redesignated areas, lands that are adjacent to tribal reservations may also qualify for hub zone status. But we also see areas where if there's been a base closure, once the military moves out of an area, oftentimes military base in a particular area may be the economic driver, likely is the economic driver for that area. And as bases were realigned and closed, certainly, gosh, it's been a while, but as they are continued to do that, those areas surrounding where those bases once were may qualify for hub zone status. Same as disaster areas. If there are qualified disaster areas, the need to get money into areas that are affected by natural disasters may qualify an area as a hub zone. In addition, we have seen over the last few years a new way for an area to be designated as a hub zone. And that is that a governor of a state may designate a particular area to be underutilized. And that, unfortunately, is something that we haven't seen a lot of lately. But that is a way for an area to be designated as a hub zone. Now, these areas, these hub zone areas, are supposed to be updated every 5 years. Over the last several years, though, we've kind of seen them paused. There's been a problem with the HUBZone maps that are available on SBA website, a historical problem that led to some confusion about if an area was actually in a hub zone or not. And so the SBA paused or froze their hub zone maps, and those maps have now been unfrozen, and we should see an update to hub zone areas. You can view on SBA's website an updated map, draft map that they have recently released. So if you're curious whether your area might be in a hub zone, you can go on SBA's website and search for an address, and it will show you whether that address is in a hub zone, and if so, what type of hub zone it falls under. Now, I mentioned before that the goal is to bring economic development to these areas, and the government wants to do so by infusing contract dollars into these hub zones, into these areas. And the government brings this money in by telling businesses, okay, we're going to award you a contract if your principal office is located in a hub zone, and if a certain number of your employees live in a hub zone, we may award you a contract for that. And again, the point is to bring development to those areas that have historically struggled. We see, and just this is a very wide view, obviously, of hub zones from SBA's map. Forgive me, I don't know if this is based on the updated map or if it's from the map when it was frozen, but you can see here, just based on this updated view, that there are a lot of areas that qualify for hub zone designation. And certainly, towards Maryland on the East Coast, we do see quite a few areas as well that might end up qualifying for hub zone. So I certainly encourage you to go on SBA's website and take a look to see if your area is covered under the HUBZone designation. In order to be a HUBZone certified business, SBA says that your business has to meet really 4 main eligibility criteria. Well, I say it's 4 main eligibility criteria, but those there's really 2 key criteria that every business thinks about when it comes to becoming a HUBZone business. First of all, your business has to be a small business under its primary NAICS code. What does that mean? Well, your size has to fall below the size standard that SBA assigns to the primary NAICS code. Those size standards are either going to be in terms of dollars, receipts, or employees. And to determine your size under a receipts or a dollar-based size standard, you're going to calculate your average annual receipts over the preceding 5 completed fiscal years. And receipts are your total income added to your cost of goods sold as those items are reported on your tax returns. So when you add those items together, you'll get your annual receipts. You'll average those out over the preceding 5 completed fiscal years. And if that size falls below, or if that dollar value falls below the dollar value, that corresponds to your principal NAICS code, then you're a small business. For employee-based size standards, which generally apply to manufacturing or supply-based industries, it's an employee calculation, your average number of employees over the preceding payrolls for the preceding 24 completed months. And so you'll take a look at those average number of employees. And again, if they fall below the size standard that is assigned to your NAICS code, then you'll be a small business. But in order to be a HUBZone business, the company first has to be a small business. The company also has to be at least 51% owned by U.S. citizens. Now, the HUBZone program is unique because SBA's other socioeconomic programs, the 8A program, the Woman-Owned Small Business Program, and the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, primarily focus their eligibility criteria off of the ownership and the control of that business. They say that in order to qualify, say, for example, for the Woman-Owned Small Business Program, the small business has to be at least 51% owned and unconditionally controlled by a woman owner. Here for the HUBZone program, rather uniquely, we're not so much focused on the ownership of the business itself. Really, you just have to be a small business that is at least 51% owned by U.S. citizens. Rather, because the point of this program is to bring dollars to specific communities, SBA's eligibility criteria instead shifts away from ownership and more towards location and employees. The third requirement is the company's principal office has to be located in a HUBZone, and at least 35% of its employees have to reside in a HUBZone. If all 4 of these criteria are met, then the company can get certified by SBA as a HUBZone business. So think about the distinction between the HUBZone program and the other socioeconomic programs in this way. You know, for the other socioeconomic programs, the ownership-based socioeconomic programs, say the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, the SBA is trying, or excuse me, the point of the program is to compensate individuals based on certain characteristics that are the point of that program. For the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, for example, the government has said, hey, we owe those veterans, those service-disabled veterans, a special obligation. And as a result of that special obligation for serving your country, we're going to award contracts to these classes of business. For woman-owned businesses and for 8A businesses, a lot of times those points are involved in remedying discrimination or allowing opportunities to individuals in categories of individuals that unfortunately have not had the same economic opportunities as others. And so that's why those eligibility criteria tend to focus on who actually owns the business. But again, the point of the HUBZone program is to bring dollars into underutilized communities. And so that's why the major eligibility criteria focus not only on where the company is located, but also where its employees live. Because the thought is, if we award contracts to businesses that meet these criteria, then we will infuse dollars into these communities and help those communities develop. Once you are in the program, so the HUBZone program, in order to certify, you have to go to the SBA, and the SBA does certify you. You can find out more about that through SBA's website, but you will need to upload a bunch of documentation to SBA through certify.sba.gov. And then once you are in, it's an annual recertification program. This is a significant change from how SBA's HUBZone regulations used to work. That is, you used to have to be eligible as of the date of your application and the date of your admission in order to get recertification. But then also, once you were certified under their old rules, you had to be HUBZone eligible as of the date of bid and as of the date of your contract award. And as you can imagine, particularly with the 35% residency requirement, that might be difficult for businesses. It might be hard to make sure that at least 35% of your employees were going to live in a HUBZone on any given day, particularly if you didn't know the day at issue. For example, you don't know the day the government's going to award a contract. And so this was a very, very hard requirement to meet. But now SBA has kind of realized and relaxed those requirements. It is saying, okay, it's an annual certification. And once you're in, we are going to determine you to be eligible for any contracts that you bid during that period. And your status is going to be determined as of the date of that bid, but you're going to have to recertify within 30 days of your anniversary date. That is, confirm to SBA, you know, that promise under penalty of perjury that you still meet those eligibility requirements. And unless something changes, generally they will recertify you. Now, SBA will go through a full programmatic review of your company every 3 years. That is, they'll actually take a look at you know, your payrolls or your revenues, and they'll take a look where your employees live and where your office is located. They'll do the deep dive every 3 years. But now this relaxed eligibility or this relaxed certification requirement provides some assurance to contractors and to contracting officers that they actually are working with qualified HUBZone companies. Let's break down these eligibility requirement a little more, particularly the two, excuse me, major eligibility requirements. And we'll talk first about the principal office. Sometimes, you know, a business might say, well, my headquarters is my principal office, because that's where I work and that's where all the mail comes, and that's where, you know, I deem the principal office to be. SBA's regulations, though, say that's not necessarily true. The company's principal office isn't necessarily its headquarters or where its leadership works. Rather, its principal office is the location where the greatest number of its employees work. Now, if that location is in a HUBZone, then the business may be eligible for HUBZone status. But there's a little bit of nuance there. For example, sometimes you might have an employee that works in more than one office location. Maybe they work 3 days, you know, in a particular office, and then they're 2 days in a remote office. Where does that person count for purposes of eligibility? Well, SBA is going to say, great question. They're going to consider the location where the person spends most of their effort or most of their time working. So it'd be that location where they spend 3 days working. If it's tied, if they spend the same amount of time, then they'll consider the non-HUBZone location. Now, for construction, this really can pose a problem. because construction industries, SBA is not going to consider a job site location to be your principal office. And so if you're working on site, that location is not going to count. And as part of that, SBA says if 50% or more of your employees work at a job site as their primary location, then you may not be eligible for HUBZone status. You may not meet this principal office requirement. That's very problematic. But we're also seeing issues come in the age of COVID, in the age of the pandemic, remote working. In that case, where do you consider the principal office to be? Well, again, this eligibility requirement wasn't really designed with that in mind. So we're kind of seeing SBA consider these issues a little bit more, but certainly it's a factor to keep in mind. If 100% of your employees work remotely, then really you may not be eligible under SBA's HUBZone criteria. So it's certainly something to keep in mind as you are going through the eligibility process. Now, historically, we have also seen an issue where businesses want to develop their principal office in a particular location, but they're gun shy, they're apprehensive to do so because they're afraid that once they make that commitment, their principal office location designation might be revoked. That is, maybe, it's no longer a qualified census tract the next time SBA takes a look at their regulations, or excuse me, at those designations. So SBA has recently updated its rule to allow for long-term investments in a HUBZone area. SBA has said that if your business enters into a long-term lease, a lease of 10 years or more, or if it buys a location that is in a HUBZone, SBA will continue to consider that location as being in a HUBZone for at least 10 years, even if the area is later redesignated as being outside of a HUBZone. So that gives businesses some assurance that if they choose a principal office location, that rug won't necessarily be pulled out from under them in a few years. It does give some long-term investment assurance. Now, this does not apply to co-leased spaces, mind you. So if you're working out of a WeWork or something like that, that's not going to apply to this situation here. But the first main criteria of being a HUBZone is to have your company's principal office located in that HUBZone. The second real substantive criteria, and by that I don't mean to diminish the requirement to be a small business or to be at least 51% owned by US citizens. Certainly those are substantive criteria, and if your business doesn't meet those, it is not eligible for HUBZone status. But what I'm focusing on here are really those eligibility requirements that are unique or a little more nuanced under the HUBZone program. That second requirement is, again, to have at least 35% of your employees reside in a HUBZone. It's a little complicated because first we have to consider, what does it mean to reside in a particular location? Well, in order to reside in a location, SBA says that generally you have to live there for at least 180 days with the intent to remain in that location. And it's going to look at things like, driver's license, utility bills, voter registrations to determine where a person on your payroll actually resides. And if once they live in that location for 30 days, or excuse me, for 180 days with that intention to remain, that's where an SBA will say, okay, they reside in that particular area. We also need to understand who an employee is, who's included in this calculation. And really, it's anybody who works for your business for at least 40 hours during the month prior to your application or recertification period. 40 hours per month. not 40 hours a week, but 40 hours per month. If they meet that threshold, then generally they qualify as an employee. It doesn't matter if they're full-time or part-time or even on some other basis, but if they're on your payroll and working that time for at least 40 hours per month, they qualify. They have to perform, according to SBA, legitimate work for the company. This requirement seems silly, but it's actually a little controversial. This requirement isn't in the regulations. That is, the regulations don't say the type of work that this employee has to do, but SBA in their interpretation and some of their guidance has said these employees have to actually perform legitimate work for the company. What is legitimate work? I don't know. SBA doesn't say, and it's probably industry specific, but the point is SBA doesn't want individuals just being on the payroll for HUBZone status. They want you to actually perform work. Now, personally, Matt Schoonover, I question that rationale, because really, if somebody's on the payroll and they're getting 40 hours per month, they meet the requirements. I personally don't think it matters so much the work that they're doing under the point of the program versus bringing dollars into that community. That is, so long as they're on the payroll, they're getting paid, they're bringing dollars into that community. But nonetheless, this might be a point of contention going forward with businesses and SBA, as SBA wants to better define kind of who qualifies as an employee. But I will say this does not include bona fide independent contractors or subcontractors. And when I say bona fide, I really do mean legitimate independent subcontractors or contractors, because sometimes I think businesses really use independent contractors in instances where they're not appropriate. Whether somebody is actually an appropriate independent contractor is a sticky question that involves principles of state law, and really is something that should not, in my opinion, be used without actually consulting appropriate counsel to determine whether that person meets the test of being an independent contractor. And it can be very problematic to get it wrong. Not only can there be consequences from the HUBZone eligibility side, but if you've incorrectly designated somebody as an independent contractor, there could be taxation problems, there could be wage and benefit problems, there could be HR problems, there could be a lot of issues. So I always encourage folks, before you start using independent contractors, take the time to understand what the bounds of an appropriate independent contractor relationship is, and make sure that you are following those, because the consequences can really be significant. So SBA's regulations, as I mentioned earlier, really contemplated that a HUBZone business would be eligible. I say any given time, because if you weren't eligible at the time you submitted your application or the time SBA admitted you to the program, then you might not get into the program in the first place. But if you weren't eligible at the time you submit your bid and whenever the agency was going to award the contract, then under the old rules, you wouldn't be eligible for the contract. And this was very problematic for businesses, particularly when it comes to the 35% employee residency requirement. It was very hard for businesses, particularly small businesses, to make sure that they were meeting that requirement on any particular day. And so now SBA has said, we're going to grandfather some employees in. We're going to allow businesses to consider employees that might have moved from a HUBZone as continuing to be in a HUBZone if they meet certain criteria. That is, SBA now allows companies to claim credit for, these grandfathered employees if they continue to live in a HUBZone for at least 180 days after their certification or recertification. This employment has to be continuous. It cannot be interrupted. Once it's interrupted, say somebody's seasonally laid off, or they leave the company for whatever reason and then they come back a little bit later, that's an interruption. Their grandfathered status stops when they leave the company. But if they continue to live in a HUBZone area for at least 180 days after that verification, SBA will continue to consider that person as living in a HUBZone, even if they were to later move out of the HUBZone. So that's very important. That gives businesses some flexibility. So let's think about the timeline this way. We're looking at a period of 180 days that a person has to reside in a location before the application or the recertification period comes to pass in order to count as residing in a HUBZone in the first place. Then once the date of that certification or recertification hits, they have to continue to live in a HUBZone for at least another 180 days in order to get that legacy status. Now, certain individuals are not eligible for this requirement. It's employees that are living in a redesignated area or a qualified disaster area. Those individuals won't count. It's very confusing, but SBA believes that these two particular HUBZones or status of HUBZones are different than the others. It has to do with the legislative enactment for them. And so if it's a redesignated area or a qualified disaster area, then those individuals will not be allowed to count as legacy employees. But I will say here, if you're relying on legacy employees, please maintain detailed records about where these individuals live and their continued employment, because SBA will want detailed records as they review these individuals. Now, each HUBZone business should maintain records in the first place. That is, you're going to want, as a HUBZone business, you're going to want current addresses where all of your employees reside, and the understanding of whether those areas are in a HUBZone or not. But that is, if you are relying on legacy employees, you're going to want detailed records to make sure that those individuals certainly have continuous employment throughout that period. And once you are in the HUBZone program and are awarded a HUBZone contract, there's another very important topic to keep in mind. That is, SBA recognizes that once you're awarded a contract, you might have employees leave and come and all of that. And it's possible that your 35% residency might dip below the required amount. You might have below 35% of your employees that live in a HUBZone. And in that case, SBA says, listen, we don't necessarily want you to lose a contract if you have an employee quit for whatever reason and now you're below 35%. What SBA wants to see is, once you're awarded a contract, you have to commit to attempt to maintain that 35% employee residency requirement. And that means that if you fall below it, SBA is going to want to see efforts to bring yourself back up. It's going to want to see job postings in HUBZone areas. It's going to want to see, that you're interviewing candidates and that you're trying to engage new employees or more employees in HUBZone areas, that you're prioritizing hiring in those areas, that you're attempting to maintain that status. But if you ever fall below 20% while you're performing a contract, that is, if fewer than 20% of your employees reside in a HUBZone, SBA will just automatically say you're not attempting to maintain that eligibility requirement, and it may terminate you from the program as a result. So certainly, even once you're in the program and performing under a contract, you want to make sure that you are maintaining that 35% employee status. So those are the major eligibility requirements when it comes to being a HUBZone. And again, they are focused on bringing dollars into specific communities. By the way, I'll say with this legacy employee requirement, it's not without controversy. That is, since the point of bringing, or the point of the program is to bring dollars into hub zones, some might question whether the legacy employee ability actually satisfies that goal. That is, if somebody moves out of a hub zone, how is continuing to bring how are they continuing to bring dollars into that program? And it's a fair question. It's one that the Office of Inspector General has raised among this requirement as well. And it's one that, as I mentioned before, is certainly not without controversy. But I think to SBA's credit here, it is saying we've got to balance the goals of the program and giving contractors and contracting officers assurance that they will be able to count their employees and be able to meet these requirements, because they're hoping that more and more contracts will be awarded under the HUBZone program. And by relaxing some of these requirements or making it easier to comply with some of these requirements, they're hoping that it'll bring that assurance. So with that in mind, let's talk about how you might leverage your HUBZone status, or why being a HUBZone matters. And here I want to back up just a little bit and say being a small business matters to the federal government. You know, the federal government every year procures, it's now getting close to $1 trillion annually in spending from the federal government each year. And the Small Business Act says, well, when the federal government awards prime contracts, we want the government to award a certain amount of those contracts to small businesses. And the Small Business Act currently sets that goal at 23% of all prime contract awards should go to small businesses. So when you consider the dollar amount of contracts each year that the government enters, certainly that is no chump change. And we see it. We see the latest numbers that SBA has reported here, where for prime contracts, small businesses alone received $154.2 billion in 2021 fiscal year. That's a record amount of federal government contracts, and we see the trend line continuing each year, where each year the federal government seems to set a record for the number of dollars it is awarding in small business contracts each year. But we are seeing, on the flip side, fewer and fewer small businesses actually competing for those contracts. That is, the number of small business participants in the contracting community is going down. And so while we're seeing greater dollar values being awarded, we're seeing fewer contracts themselves awarded. So those contracts, while they're fewer and fewer between, certainly have a greater and greater value. And so when we talk about leveraging your competition, or leveraging your status to enhance your competition, really it's how does your small business compete for a fewer amount or for a lesser amount of contracts by number, but greater in value. And we break down the numbers here. SBA breaks down the numbers here, and I'll point you to the bottom number. It's SBA's HUBZone contracting awards. We see that its percentage goal for 2021 was 3%, and it fell below that. That is the usual. The federal government has never met its HUBZone contracting goal. That every year that since it's been tracking these numbers, it has fallen short of meeting its HUBZone goal. But we are seeing a little bit of trickle up in those numbers. Now, I tend to think that a lot of the numbers that are reported, the 2.53% that's reported, some of those are probably contracts that were awarded to other designations, and they're double counting for HUBZone credit on there. But we still do see 14.3%, or excuse me, $14.3 billion in HUBZone awards. And so that's not chump change by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, when we consider the goal of the program is to infuse dollars into these communities. The fact that we're falling short of this goal is very problematic. And last year in 2022, I had the pleasure of testifying before Congress about some of the issues that face the HUBZone program. And I was asked, how can we improve the HUBZone program? And my bottom line recommendation or bottom line statement was simple. It was, listen, if we want to improve the program, the HUBZone program, we need to require it to be used more. We need to get those numbers up. We need contracting officers to award more HUBZone contracts. We need more businesses to participate as HUBZone businesses, certainly because the more popular the program is, it's I think going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more dollars we bring to these communities. And so certainly I think it's just a shame that we do not see as many HUBZone awards out there as we should, but nonetheless, there is value for businesses in getting that HUBZone status. In addition to prime contracts, by the way, small businesses play a vital role when it comes to subcontracting. And so even if you're not necessarily chasing prime contracts, there could be opportunities for your business as a subcontractor under one of these contracts that require a subcontracting plan, and certainly billions of dollars on the table, even for HUBZone businesses as well. So what are some of the benefits to the HUBZone program? Well, sole source awards, that is directed awards. That usually when the federal government issues or wants to procure a good or a service, it needs to do so on a competitive basis. That is, it needs to put that out for competition and allow folks to bid on it. And so the government can choose the most appropriate contractor under the stated evaluation criteria. But there's an exception to competition requirements. And that is, in some cases, the government may issue what's called a sole source or a directed award to an individual company. And for the HUBZone program, it can do so if the anticipated value of the contract falls below $4.5 million or $7.5 million for manufacturing. And that's tremendous. That gives options for HUBZone companies, an automatic in with certain agencies. That is, rather than going through the process of competition, in some cases, the government might just say, we're going to give you the contract. And that can be a tremendous benefit. But even when the government decides to compete that opportunity, it might set aside the contract for HUBZone businesses. That is, only businesses that are HUBZone certified can participate under that solicitation or be eligible for an award under that solicitation. And we see, the FAR allows for HUBZone set-aside contracts and for any procurement valued above the micro purchase threshold, which I think right now is $10,000. So for any procurement above $10,000, it can set that aside for HUBZone businesses if the government reasonably believes that 2 or more HUBZone concerns will submit an offer at a fair and reasonable price. And so here's where I think HUBZone businesses can do some of their own homework or help themselves a little bit, so to speak. Respond to RFIs, respond to sources sought, reach out to government contracting officers that you're aware of to say, hey, here's a capability statement. Here's the type of work that we're really good at. If you gave us this project, we would knock it out of the park. And here's our real core experience. Here's what we can do for you and the type of work that we focus on. And oh, by the way, we are a HUBZone. If you release any of this work for us or any work that falls in this wheelhouse as a HUBZone, we would bid on it. And make sure, if you know of other HUBZone businesses that are out there, they're doing that too. And that seems counterintuitive because you might be saying, I don't want my competition speaking with the government. And that's a fair point. But keep in mind that if the government knows that there's at least 2 or more HUBZone businesses out there that are going to submit a bid, it can set that aside for HUBZone concerns. And so by encouraging other HUBZone businesses, if you're aware of them, to discuss with the government, you might help set contracts aside for HUBZone businesses, meaning that your pool of competition could be lower for those contracts. So really give it some thought, really do some advocating for yourself with contracting officers. And by the way, this now extends to the FAA. Historically, FAA did not follow the HUBZone program. FAA is kind of its own unique creature where it's exempt from the FAR and from, a lot of these contracting requirements. If you've ever contracted with the FAA, it's its own universe. But in 2021, FAA announced that it would start using HUBZone set-asides, which is great. That's another opportunity for HUBZone businesses to work with the federal government. And so that's tremendous, and we should start seeing a benefit to it. But in addition, benefits to being a HUBZone aren't limited to sole source and set-aside awards. That is, as a HUBZone, you might get under certain procurements what's called the price evaluation preference, the HUBZone price evaluation preference. This applies to unrestricted procurements, except in a few cases. If price isn't considered as part of the evaluation, if it's a portion under a contract that's reserved for small businesses, or if all offers are going to be accepted under the procurement. Otherwise, this generally applies to any unrestricted procurement. Unrestricted procurement means any business can bid on that opportunity. It can be a small business, it can be a large business. It is unrestricted on who can qualify. But if you submit an offer as a HUBZone under that, you might get the HUBZone evaluation price preference. That is, the contracting officer has to add 10% to your competitors' prices, except for other small businesses that are competing in that procurement too. But if you're going to be chosen for award, or if you're in that realm of competition, if you're in that analysis there for the best value, the government has to consider your competitors, those unrestricted competitors, as bidding 10% higher than what they did. And that can be a tremendous benefit because that can help make you the best value. Now, this is not without strings attached. Remember, for an unrestricted procurement, the limitation on subcontracting generally does not apply. The limitation on subcontracting says, hey, for under small business procurements, we're going to limit the amount of work that the prime contractor can subcontract out. The point being is that the government doesn't want those small businesses to be pass-throughs for that work. They want to ensure that those dollars are actually going to small business concerns. And so they limit the amount of work that the prime contractor can subcontract under a small business set-aside. Now, because it's an unrestricted procurement, the limitation on subcontracting ordinarily doesn't apply. But if you choose to have the HUBZone price preference, and this is something that you'll check the box when you're bidding under a program, under an unrestricted procurement, if you choose the benefit of the price preference, then what you're saying is, I will agree, if you award this contract to me, to follow the limitation on subcontracting. In order to get the price preference, you've got to comply with the limitation on subcontracting. So it's a little bit of a give and take. Just keep that in mind. Now, you can waive the price preference. You can say, I don't want the price preference. And in that case, you're not going to have to comply with the limitation on subcontracting. But if you get the benefit of the price preference, the government wants to hold you to it and make sure that, and say, okay, well, we want you to comply with that limitation on subcontracting. So we will ensure that those dollars go to HUBZone businesses. Now, that's great, and that's very, very competitive. That helps small businesses, HUBZone small businesses, be competitive under certain procurements. But I will say that there is a dispute over whether the HUBZone price preference applies to orders under IDIQ contracts. And right now, the government says no. The price preference does not apply to orders under these IDIQ contracts, which can be problematic. Because a lot of times, you know, these IDIQ contracts might be issued on an unrestricted basis. So you'll get the price preference on the base contract. But if they're a multiple award contract, that's really of limited value. Rather, the proof is going to be in the pudding, so to speak. The actual price is going to matter under the orders. And according to the government, speaking as a monolith, the price preference does not apply to orders that are issued under multiple award contracts. Now, there is some contention about this, and there is some movement in Congress to try and get the price preference to apply to orders. And I think that if it does, HUBZone businesses will just be that much more competitive under these procurements. They'll get the benefit of that competition even under orders. And so certainly, you know, I encourage folks to reach out to their representatives, to reach out to their congressperson so that they can explain, yes, we do want the HUBZone price preference to apply to orders. Beyond that, though, I'm gonna say one more thing relating to my testimony before Congress, and that is to kind of sound an alarm bell. There were some in Congress that, because the HUBZone program is not meeting its goals, there were some that were wondering aloud whether we need to scrap the program entirely and start over. And I think that that would be a tremendous disservice, not only to those companies that are currently in the program and that are wanting to be in the program, but also to the communities that the program is designed to improve and enhance and provide that development for. But I say that with an encouragement for you to reach out to your representatives and explain to them the benefits of being a small business government contractor. Explain to them how these programs matter to your business and help bring dollars to your communities, because that speaks the language of an elected official. You want to make sure that your elected officials at every level know the benefit of these contracting dollars and these contracting programs to small businesses, because I think that by advocating for ourselves and for our community, that's really where we're going to make sure that Congress is doing what it can to preserve these programs. And I know I'm probably going a little bit astray from what I can talk about on an Apex webinar, but I will say, certainly I encourage you to reach out to your representatives and share with them your success stories as a small business. And so with that, you know, that is kind of the ins and outs of the HUBZone program. I love the program. I think it's a wonderful way to bring dollars to communities, and to the extent you are thinking about becoming HUBZone certified, again, I would continue to encourage you to sit down with Apex, reach out to me, reach out to others, but it is a tremendously vital program, particularly once more and more people participate in it. So with that, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that anybody might have about the program.
Thank you, Matthew. Great as usual. So yes, now's your opportunity for you to ask Matthew your questions, or if you'd like to go over a section of the presentation again that you missed out on or want further clarification on. I'm going to scroll through the chat box now. You may have answered some of these, Matthew, already, but we'll just go through them.
Sure.
The first one is, well, I can answer this one. Is this being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded. I posted the link in the chat box. It will be available later today, and I will be sending out the slides as well. Okay, second question is, can a company be granted HUBZone certification if the owner is the only employee and the office is in, it's a home office in a designated HUBZone area?
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, nice and quick.
Again, so long as it meets the other eligibility requirements.
Okay, all right, wonderful. Let's see. Do the rules change for remote employees?
The rules themselves haven't changed yet. And that's one of the things that we are seeing, I think, SBA kind of grapple with Updating regulations is not an easy or a fast process, but certainly the age of remote workers has complicated HUBZone eligibility. So again, I would encourage you to reach out, to Yasmin and her team, reach out to me or another government contracts attorney so that we can help you understand what the eligibility for your company might be given its remote workers.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, would you encourage those of us who are just starting, who don't have employees but have our principal location, to apply to the program?
Yes, I would. And the reason why is because I think having a designation makes you a more attractive contractor for businesses, maybe a subcontractor for large businesses or a contractor for the federal government, because it allows them to, quote unquote, check the box, to claim credit under something. So if you're eligible for the program, I would encourage you to consider applying for it. Yes.
Okay, that looks like all the questions. So I'm going to thank everybody for participating today, and thank you, Matthew. Matthew teaches for us at least 2 to 3 times a year. So I put the link in the chat box for all our calendar of events coming up. So please do scroll through there and register. They're all free to you as a business owner. And of course, don't forget to reach out to your Maryland Apex Accelerator counselor if you need advice. They're waiting to assist you. So thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you on a future webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Take care.